The Minnesota Wild traded Freddy Gaudreau to the Seattle Kraken today. So what's the biggest prize in the trade? The pick, the roster spot, or the cap space? Let's talk it out on Locked on Wild.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we will break down all the angles of the Freddy Gaudreau to Seattle trade. Take a look at Freddy's tenure in Minnesota, and we'll try to figure out which of the different aspects of this trade actually means the most. The return, the cap space, the roster spot. We'll discuss all of those angles, as well as the Brendan Gaunce trade on today's show. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked on Wild, host of Seth on Sports, and credentialed media member, and just as I was about to do an episode wondering when we were going to see something happen this offseason. You can ask Trav in the comments. We had just exchanged a comment earlier today wondering, you know, for as much as Bill Guerin says he doesn't want to just sit on his hands, there seems to be a lot of hand sitting going on. Freddy Gaudreau has been traded to the Seattle Kraken. The return, a 2025 fourth-round pick. Now, the particulars of this trade: Seattle is taking on all of the remainder of Freddy Gaudreau's contract, which frees up an additional $2.1 million for the Wild in cap space, giving them $17.7 million roughly for available cap space. Freddy's contract was not as albatrossy as some of the others have been. You know, we saw a similar move by the Edmonton Oilers to send Evander Kane to the Vancouver Canucks to try to get his contract off the books. We've seen the New York Rangers make a couple of contract trades here over the last, half a year. Freddy Gaudreau's contract was $2.1 million for the next 3 seasons. So that's pretty modest for a player of Freddy's caliber, a clear-cut bottom 6 player that had some upside, at least from a goal scoring perspective. All told, for Goudreau, he finishes his Minnesota Wild tenure with 55 goals in 307 games played, far and away the most games that he has played in his career. In fact, 410 career NHL games for Freddy Gaudreau, and 300 of them with the Minnesota Wild. So a player who kind of found his NHL identity with the Minnesota Wild over the last 4 seasons. But to counter that point, do we really know exactly what Freddy Gaudreau is? I mean, he's a steady presence in the lineup, and one that has or had double-digit goals in 3 of his 4 seasons with the Minnesota Wild. But large stretches of kind of quiet play, elite in the shootout, if you count that as part of this puzzle. Elite in the shootout. But you take things to the next level. You take it to the postseason, and in 18 career playoff games with the Minnesota Wild, Goudreau had 4 points. Ironically, all of them were goals. But in 6 games this past postseason against the Vegas Golden Knights, playing in an elevated role, Goudreau did not register a point and registered 2 shots on goal in the 6 games. And for a guy who was playing, at least to start the series, an elevated role in the lineup, he had a 39.3 face-off percentage. That was really Freddy's bread and butter over his tenure with the Minnesota Wild. Was one of their better face-off winners. This past year, he won at 48.2%, was at 49.2% for his entire Minnesota Wild tenure. But here's what I think this represents for the Minnesota Wild. Freddy Gaudreau was a known quantity as a veteran player. He was somebody that you could roughly pencil in what you were going to get from him. You were going to get a steady presence defensively, not flashy offensively. And by shipping him to the Seattle Kraken, you open up the opportunity to fill the spot with something that can give you more. Will that be a free agent signing? Will that be a trade? Will that be a young player getting an opportunity to cut their teeth at the NHL level? It could be any of the three of those. And so as we identify what is the most attractive part of this trade, the cap space is nice. $17-ish million to work with now. That's a nice amount to be able to add a couple of key pieces to this group. The fourth round pick is a draft pick that you can use this year to just kind of stash something in the system. But I think the roster spot is the most attractive piece of this puzzle. And we have been asking for a clear separation between the top 6 and the bottom 6 on this team, and even a clear separation between the top 9 and the bottom 3. And Freddy Gaudreau, a player who had at times filled in a top 6 role, just, it would work for a time and then things kind of went cold. So he wasn't somebody that should be in that role on a regular basis. But again, a steadying presence, better in the locker room than on the ice, and 14 plus goals in 3 of the 4 seasons here. He did some good things offensively, but I think it just represents an opportunity for the Minnesota Wild to upgrade in the lineup. And his roster spot on this team certainly in question as well, depending on what happens with the roster down the middle. If you assume, let's just say that Marco Rossi, for all intents and purposes, is back, as the market for him continues to be relatively quiet. If that was the case, he's what? The 3rd or 4th center on this roster? And you just start kind of comparing him to the other guys, and you're like, okay, Freddie to Marco Rossi. And I know John Hines put Freddie higher up in the lineup, but how'd that work out? Compared between the two, would you rather have Freddie? Would you rather have Rossi? You'd rather have Rossi. Would you rather have Freddie or Joel Eriksson Ek? You'd rather have Joel Eriksson Ek. Would you rather have Ryan Hartman or Freddy Gaudreau? Now, that might be a little closer, but I still think just for what is there offensively, I think I would probably rather have Hartman in that case. So if Freddie was going to be sticking around, he was probably going to be a 4th-line guy. And is it worth it to have somebody like that? Because here's the other piece of this, is that when Freddie was on a line with better players around him, his production increased, as you would expect. But when he was in that type of 3rd or 4th line role, the production really was not there at all. He had the season with Kevin Fiala and Matt Boldy that a few years, his first year with the Minnesota Wild, that he looked really good down the stretch. And then he again was thrust into a top 6 role, which led to him scoring 19 goals and putting up 38 points. But then the 3rd season he was there, he got injured early on in the season and just was never the same guy. If you have talent around him, he can be the 3rd part of that group. But you take that away and the production is just, it's pretty quiet. So Bill Guerin has said all offseason that he's not going to make any moves that make the team worse. So by subtracting a player off the roster, there's got to be a part 2 to this. There's got to be a part B, plan B to this move. You free up a roster spot to either bring somebody in via free agency or you have clear-cut plans as to how you can fill that spot in the organization and get more consistent production, get more offensive upside. That is, I think, the way that this works for this move. It's all about the roster spot at this point. Yes, a little bit of cap flexibility. The 4th round pick it's a 4th round pick, but freeing up a spot and freeing up a little cap space for July 1st those are the prizes that come with trading a guy like Freddy Gaudreau to the Seattle Kraken. Now, what are the Seattle Kraken getting? For those Kraken fans that have flipped over to Locked On Wild to get a little intel as to what you can get from Freddy Gaudreau, he's a steady bottom 6 center. You know, he's capable of putting the puck in the net. I would say that offense isn't necessarily his strong suit, but he's capable of scoring, and he'll win you some faceoffs in the bottom 6. He plays pretty solid defense. He just is he's a known quantity as a veteran, I think is the best way to put that. You plug him into the lineup, you're going to get a set amount. You're really not going to get much higher than that, but you aren't going to get a ton of poor performances. You're only going to get a limited amount of impact for what he brings to the table. So was shocked that it was Freddie. I guess that was the first one to go, but this was, I think, a needed step for Bill Guerin. Is, you know, he locked all these guys in, gave all this trade protection. This was the hard choice that you needed to at least see a little bit of setting up the offseason, is the willingness to upgrade different spots in the lineup. So we will try to set the table for what is coming next and who stands to benefit from this within the organization. We'll talk about all that. Plus, JJ Peterka was traded. You'll never believe the Wild were outbid by the offer that was taken by Utah. We'll talk about that as well here today on today's episode of Locked On Wild. More is on the way after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Monarch Money. Do you ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building your wealth. My favorite part about Monarch Money is that it combines all of the different aspects of finance, whether it be your bank account, your credit cards, your loans. You can have it all in one place. So it's easy to keep track of where your money is going and what your balances are on your other accounts. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for 50% off your first year. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We will have plenty more draft coverage coming up for you here before the draft gets going tomorrow. So make sure to keep an eye out for draft profiles throughout the day. We'll, of course, react to whoever the Wild do select on Saturday, unless they move back into the first round. I guess there's a small percentage that could happen. It's not likely, but we'll keep our eyes peeled, and whatever happens this weekend, we'll make sure to let you know. Back to what has been going on here today. So we found out that Freddy Gaudreau was traded, again, a 2025 fourth-round pick. And here's where the roster stands right now. Now, according to Puckpedia, they actually, interestingly enough, they have Vinny Hinostroza listed amongst the non-rostered forwards. And I guess that makes sense because the Wild at this point, they want to make sure that they have open roster spots to plug in guys that they potentially add to the roster. So factoring that in, factoring Danila Yurov and Liam Ohgren onto the NHL roster, you're currently sitting at 10 forwards. You've got Marcus Johansson, Liam Ohgren, Danila Yurov, Yakov Trenyan, Ryan Hartman, Marcus Foligno, Matt Zuccarello, Joel Eriksson Ek, Matt Boldy, Kirill Kaprizov. Those are your 10 forwards. So as it stands right now, there are spots available. You factor Vinny Hinostroza maybe into a fourth line or 13th forward spot, and that's 11 of your 13 forwards. But that means there's still room for 2 more. Now, if Marco Rossi were to not get moved, that would be 12 of the 13. But even then, with Liam Ohgren and Danila Yurov making the NHL roster, you still have room for 1 player to add into the mix. So moving Freddy Gaudreau off the roster, it feels strategic. And whether this is where Brock Boeser comes into the equation, whether this is where another player comes into the equation, it feels strategic to leave that spot open. Now, the latest on Marco Rossi is we have heard reports around the league that Bill Guerin maintains his ask in return for Rossi is an established NHL player. Every team in which he has dealt with as far as trades go, and there are teams that are interested, but every team that has inquired on Marco Rossi has offered picks or prospects. So Bill Guerin, I guess the good part about this is that Bill Guerin hasn't reached the trade to make a trade situation. And maybe this was the itch maybe this was the way to scratch that itch was moving Freddy Gaudreau, but he has not traded Rossi for the sake of moving him off the roster. Now, it's possible that there's going to be a team within the first couple of days of free agency that misses out on who they are asking for. And they circle back and they say, well, we were offering Brock Boeser 8.5, didn't get him, need a top 6 forward. All right, let's talk. It is possible that a team meets that asking price for Marco Rossi later, but it just seems like teams are unwilling to do so at this point in the offseason. Bill Guerin made some interesting comments today in saying that all of a sudden every GM, it seems, is trying to get better. Well, gee, I wonder why that is. GMs have a shelf life. And if you don't show tangible progress on your tenure, then the ownership group is going to find somebody else to come in and do the job for you. And if you look at it too, as far as teams go, the only teams that have shown a willingness to make any sort of moves, the Pittsburgh Penguins have said we're open for business. But teams like the Philadelphia Flyers are trying to continue a trend in the upward direction. The San Jose Sharks trying to continue a trend in the upward direction. The Chicago Blackhawks, same thing. The Nashville Predators are trying to get it right this year, but Barry Trotz has been very public in saying it may require after this year, if this does not improve, it may require us hitting the reset button, but that's after this upcoming season. The Seattle Kraken have a new general manager and a new head coach. They are aggressively trying to get themselves back into playoff mode, so they're not selling. The Anaheim Ducks had a 21-point improvement, even though they fired Greg Cronin. who's now Iowa coach. And if you're curious as to what Greg Cronin brings to the table, make sure to check out yesterday's episode of Locked On Wild, in which we hear from Greg Cronin himself in his introductory press conference, some of the remarks he had for the assembled media. But the Anaheim Ducks had a 21-win improvement. They're not trying to take a step back. All these teams are trying to get this right. They're trying to continue a trajectory in the right direction. So, yeah, teams are at this point are holding on to a lot of their rostered players, which is why you're getting draft picks and prospects as the likeliest return. And Bill Guerin doesn't want that. That doesn't really help you unless you're going to take those and flip them for somebody else. It doesn't help you this year. So there's no point in making that move. That would be, as Bill Guerin puts it himself, that would be a trade making the team worse. So in the midst of this self-inflicted situation, good job not trading Marco Rossi just for the sake of trading him to be done with it. You got to play the long game here. You have to get requisite value in return if you're going to give up a player like that. They don't just come available often. So as of right now, it still looks as though there's a stalemate between the two. But if it's going to happen this offseason, I would imagine sometime shortly after July 1st, within the next week after, I would imagine that's when it happens. Because then you'll get to the point where teams are trying to, they're trying to sign players off of free agency, and if they don't get their guy, then they may look to upgrade some other way. Unless you're the Buffalo Sabres and you are making moves just for the sake of making moves. When we come back, we'll talk about JJ Peterka, who was traded to the Utah Mammoth, but not for a return that was the best compared to what else was out there. And Marco Rossi was out there for Peterka. We'll talk about that to finish today's episode of Locked On Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Rugiet Ready. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast, on average in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options haven't worked for you, Rugiet might be the answer. Over 150,000 men have already made the switch. So head to Rugiet.com/LockedOnNHL and use code LockedOnNHL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNHL and use promo code LockedOnNHL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. For the month of July, post-free agency, we are going to begin a series of evaluations of players from this past season. Saved it until we got to the doldrums. So we'll do those. Then the month of August, we got some fun crossovers planned with the rest of the Locked On hosts. And before you know it, then it'll be time to be gearing up for the 2025-2026 season. But before we get there, JJ Peterka was traded yesterday for the Utah Mammoth. And it was two players that came back in that trade. And to be honest, it was not what really anybody expected to receive. Now, the players that were acquired, Josh Doan and Michael Kesslering, they're not bad players. Kesslering is 25. Doan is 23. So they're building block pieces for the Buffalo Sabres. But Frank Saravalli on the Daily Faceoff indicated that there were some far better options available in this trade. There was one team, as Saravalli said, that offered 2 first-round picks and 2 players. The Minnesota Wild had Marco Rossi on the table, as has been reported. It's been reported here in the state, as well as abroad. Rossi that was offered to the Sabres, in addition to picks or players to make it work. So the Wild did have a concrete offer in on JJ Peterka, and the Sabres said no, because they did not want, in their estimation, I think Russo said this in his latest for The Athletic, they did not want another undersized forward. The St. Louis Blues at one point had Jordan Kyrou on the table in a Peterka trade scenario. I would imagine that was pretty brief and may have involved a few other pieces. Had to have, because you're not just going to trade Kyrou for Peterka straight up. And the Islanders had Noah Dobson on the table. Again, I would imagine that was in initial discussions. So for the Sabres, yeah, they get a couple of building block pieces, not like key pieces, but building block pieces to add into the mix. And for as much as the Minnesota Wild tried to make it work, Buffalo just straight up was like, nah, we're good. So as much fun as Peterka would have been to be here, I guess Kevin Adams had other plans. So fascinating, though, that St. Louis was involved and that Jordan Kyrou was on the at least on the table for a bit. Now that this is done, do you maybe see teams that lost out on Peterka circle back to Marco Rossi? It could be the case. Could be the case that teams that missed out on him will try to kind of reignite things a little bit. But interesting to just think about this as well is you look at the players that are available in free agency. Now that the Wild have $17 million in cap space to throw around. John Tavares is still available. Does he go back to Toronto? It sounds like there's an offer on the table to do that. Brock Boeser is one of the top as far as AAV goes. Pretty much all of the top free agents as far as annual salary goes are all defensemen. Brock Boeser is one of the top 2 wings that are an option. So do the Minnesota Wilds make a big push to get Brock Boeser now that they've got a roster spot open and some cap space? That seems to be, and I'm going to pull this full circle as we always do. That seems to be kind of the, like, you see magicians a lot of times do the, hey, pay attention to what I'm doing here and don't pay attention to what's going on down here. So it feels like the outward leader in the clubhouse is a push for Brock Boeser. But much like this Freddy Gaudreau trade, which kind of popped out of nowhere, I kind of feel like there's something going on that is behind the scenes, behind the curtain, as far as how to upgrade this top 6. Because as we've said all along, a trade is the much better route to go to try to make an impact in that top 6. And whether it be a center, whether it be a wing, it doesn't really matter at this point. As we said, as the everydayers will remember, from when the season ended, you have to make an impact move in the top 6 if you want this team to get to the next level. Bill Guerin also, though, kind of tried to douse some water on that fire when he said, free agent market's kind of dry. Not a lot of teams that are looking to sell. There may not be a big move that happens this offseason, which would be disappointing because all of the talk, all of the rhetoric ever since Zach Parise and Ryan Suter were bought out is that we are going to push the doors down the moment that money is back on the table. And it's like you're getting ready for a giant Black Friday sale. And you, as a department store, have a ton of great deals. There's a department store that has just crazy deals. You're going to get in line. You're going to be one of the first ones because you just got paid. You're going to be one of the first ones to go in and spend the money. You're going to just spend crazy money on a brand new TV, a new gaming system, whatever it may be. And at the last minute, all of a sudden, you're like, do I really need those things? So be paying attention to what's going on behind the curtain too. That's all I'm saying. And as far as the biggest piece for this trade, well, trading Freddy Gaudreau, at least at this point, has probably opened up a spot for Liam Ohgren to make the roster. So trading players off the roster is not all bad. It just depends on what the Wild do with the money they have available. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. If you like today's episode, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day.